Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back. Today is the day. It's time for the big reveal for the Great Guitar Build Off 2021. I'm not going to do an outro to this video, so I want to take the time now to say thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for all your support. It's been an honor, again, to compete in the invitational build-off, and I hope you guys will take the time to watch the other builders, support their builds, support your favorite charities, and bid on your favorite guitars if you can. Don't forget to check out greatguitarbuildoff.com to vote for your favorite builds and support your favorite charities that way. And that's about it. The sound demo will follow, but for now, I hope you enjoy the build. Guitar and bass hold a special place among the instruments, and that's because of their personality, the way they're treated. What makes a good guitar or a good bass is very subjective. It's all a matter of personal preference. There are lots of options, and really, you can do what you want to them. There are those who believe that all of the best guitars are already out there, that they've already been made. I disagree. I think guitar is too subjective for that to be the case. There's always something that you can change, that you can improve on, maybe not objectively for the instrument as a whole, but for you, for what you're looking for, what feels right and what looks right to you. This isn't how it works with other instruments. If you make a violin with a fingerboard that has a broader radius, you've made it wrong. If you paint an interesting stripe pattern on a tuba, you will look like a fool. With a guitar, however, all of these things can be modified, can be changed to look and feel the way that you want them to. So, what makes a great guitar? Well, it's really up to whoever's going to be making it and whoever's going to be playing it. For this year's Great Guitar Build-Off, I've started with a raw, uncut kit from Crimson Guitars. They supplied it, they've sponsored this contest, and I thank them for that. The charity that I've chosen is a Second Chance Animal Rescue. If you've been watching my videos, you know that I selected them because during this pandemic, I think a lot of people have adopted animals, mostly due to lockdown, to being, stuck at home with no one or nothing to do. And as they move back to their regular lives, having animals may become less convenient, and I fear that some of them will be returned. So that's something that I felt the need to try to help with by supporting Second Chance Animal Rescue, who helps with the shelters and relocating animals and taking care of them when they need it. For my guitar, I've veered away from the traditional. There are a lot of builders and a lot of guitars out there where the goal seems to be to take a traditional, a classic shape and make a minor modification to it, something to make it your own. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, and the classic shapes are classic for a reason. They work well, they look nice, they feel good, and they're familiar to us all. But there are a lot of them, so I've elected to go with something a little different. As I draw my pattern on the blank piece of wood here, I'm thinking of a couple of very ergonomic designs that are not classic, a couple of interesting guitars that I've seen that I think will feel really good to play and that, in my opinion, look very cool. So that's what this is all about for me. One, the guitar has to be playable, it has to be comfortable. A guitar that's difficult or cumbersome to play is not worthwhile, in my opinion. That is the key aspect. Next, it needs to look good. And of course, everyone has a different idea of what looks good, but it needs to look good to me, and hopefully to whoever ends up with it. This is important. It's not as important as having it feel good and play well, but it's important because it's not that difficult to find a guitar that looks good. As I said, there are lots of options out there, and there are lots of beautiful guitars. You can see I've also mapped out some plating on my guitar. Now, plating isn't necessary, of course. In some cases, it's practical. For example, the one next to my neck will hold the neck pickup. So it has its uses that way. It's also going to be made of metal, which allows it to act as shielding in helping create kind of that faux Faraday cage that we try to make around our electronics to avoid interference from outside electrical sources like neon signs and things of that nature. So there is a practical aspect to it, but in my opinion, it looks really cool. And the way that I do metal plating, well, I include that in as many of my guitars as I can because it's something that's personal to me. It's a style that I've kind of developed, and it's something that makes one of my guitars recognizable. Now, last year, I did this stage that you're watching right now, cutting out the guitar, entirely with a jigsaw. And it wasn't great. It worked, but cutting out a thick piece of solid ash like this with a jigsaw is a challenge, and it is slow and arguably dangerous and kind of kicks all over the place. So if you're someone who follows my channel, you'll know I just got this bandsaw. This is my first big project with it. How fitting that I would finally get to use a good bandsaw for a build like this, and how fitting that I would have this beautiful new tool to help me out with the great guitar build off. It made an incredible difference. This was actually quite a quick endeavor. This footage is sped up quite a bit, but putting in relief cuts, even cutting corners with this huge 3/4 inch blade was a lot easier than trying to work with the jigsaw. If you have the opportunity to pick up a decent bandsaw, if you're going to be doing this kind of work, it makes a huge difference. So I recommend doing some research and finding one that you're going to like and going for it, because this was one of my favorite parts of this build, which is unusual for me. With that said, though, I think we can speed the rest of the cutting up a little bit. You will also notice some lines on this design that don't look like plating, and that's because they're not. I've designed this to have a couple of levels to it, which means I'm also going to need to use two separate templates. The first is the outside line. This is the area of the guitar that you're of course going to interact with the most. You can see that I've got my arm bevel there. There have been a lot of questions about this. This is in the top corner. A lot of questions from people wondering if this is a good idea, wondering if this is going to feel good, just generally suggesting that maybe it shouldn't be there because it's not a standard arm carve. I put one of these in on my guitar last year, and I did some tests before I put it in, and I found that it was a very comfortable thing to have there. And for me, I thought that it wasn't just ergonomically pleasing, I thought it was also aesthetically pleasing. I think it looks cool. So after adding it in last year and after trying it, I decided I definitely had to include it again this year. And it's something that I will probably put on most of my builds, if not all of them, depending on the styling, because it's so comfortable. It's a perfect place for me to rest my arm when I play. I know the end user, the purchaser of my build from last year, really liked it, really continues to like it, and finds that it makes playing very comfortable. So I've made a point of including it again because I find it much more comfortable than the classic arm carve, much more comfortable than just a standard bevel. So I hope that whoever ends up with this guitar will enjoy it as much as I did on last year's model, and as much as I have on this one during my test playing for this particular guitar. I think that this is something that we should see on more models. I know not everyone will agree with me, and some people will think that it just doesn't look right. But if it makes its way onto a few more guitars and people start to get used to it, I'm pretty sure that argument will disappear, because for some reason, anytime something is new, there's always someone who just doesn't think it looks right. The pickguard material and plating material on this guitar is aluminum. Aluminum's very conductive, so as I mentioned earlier, it does have that shielding capability, and can essentially connect with your copper tape to make sure that your electronics are properly protected from interference. It also has some pretty reflective properties to it when it's treated properly, and you guys will see how I do that if you haven't seen my metal art style work before. It manages to have something of a holographic effect that I try to include as often as I can. Now, I do have a beautiful router bit from Radiant Tools that should be able to do the entire side of this guitar at once, and very smoothly. It broke while I was using it, and it started to chatter, and I think the shaft on it somehow kind of bent. It was really a strange ordeal in general. So I'm doing this the slower way, and luckily I gave myself a little bit of extra room to sand a few things because there was some machine chatter there from the router that needed to be taken out. Building a guitar like this is always an adventure. It's an experience that usually has at least one or two challenges that come up, unless you do it every day and you've got all of your tools set up to do, the same type of thing fairly frequently. There's always something that you need to fix or something that you need to think your way through. But that's what makes it interesting and fun, and in a way, that's what allows you to kind of make the instrument truly yours, to change what you need to change, to make it feel right, to test it out as you go along. I held this guitar as though I were trying to play it many times along the way as I was building it, which felt kind of silly because it was in this shape, but it's important. It's important to get a sense of what your guitar is going to feel like, get a sense of what kind of curves, etc. you're going to want. For me, I like smooth curves in my guitars. I don't like a bunch of angular shapes, but at the same time, I do like sharp changes in direction, points, corners, the type of thing that gives a guitar a more aggressive look, a little bit more metal, if you will, as opposed to exclusively smooth, rounded edges. For me, that creates a more fluid and interesting look than straight lines and angles, and also certainly a more interesting look than something that's exclusively smooth curves that looks like it was drawn with a set of French curves. Another element that I'm adding to this guitar, as you can see right now, to make it a little more interesting, is a couple of level changes. So there's one in that top corner by the upper horn and one right at the bottom here. Now this in particular is inspired a little bit by the type of thing that you would see on a headless guitar, but it's not positioned quite where you would see it on a headless guitar, and it's certainly not going to serve that particular function. When I was doing my shape testing for this one, I strongly considered just cutting this area out, removing it entirely. From an aesthetics perspective, I liked what that did to the curves. I thought that would make it look a little more interesting and that it would feel good. But I was incorrect about that last part. Ergonomically, it just didn't work. It didn't sit correctly on my leg. It took away a little bit too much weight that made me start to worry a bit about neck dive. There were a couple of problems. So I've reached what I feel like is a happy medium here, where I take away part of it, I get that aesthetic feel, I get kind of the added interest of having that, but at the same time I still have the rounded bottom edge of the guitar, which will sit on my leg in the kind of classic way and feel a little bit more familiar, and that familiar feel for that part of the guitar is what I find more comfortable. When I did my guitar body shape reveal on my channel, this upper section, the upper horn, was one of the largest areas of contention. I found that interesting. There were a few who said that the rest of the guitar was nice, but that this part ruined it for them. And there were a few who said they really liked it. That further demonstrates my point that guitar is very subjective, and, some things some people will like and some they won't. The classic shapes, luckily, appeal to most of us, which is nice. But when you start to move into the more unfamiliar territory of these slightly unusual shapes, it changes. Things become a little bit more polarized. So I will tell you that I am fond of how this upper horn looks and how it feels for that matter. But it doesn't really play a large role in actually playing the guitar. The impact of it on the feel of actually playing it is pretty much non-existent. There's not a whole lot there outside of the fact that you still have the curve that you can rest against your chest, similar to a lot of the classic shapes. That's why it's there on those shapes, and that's why I've kept it, because it's an ergonomic piece that is important. From an aesthetics perspective, it balances out the other horns somewhat and gives it a slightly more familiar look than if I were to just remove this area entirely, which I never planned on doing. And rather than having a really smooth transition, having this somewhat stark level change, that created an interesting new element for me. It's not something that I've really seen before. I'm sure it exists out there somewhere, but for me, this was an interesting change that added a nice personal touch. And it allowed me to do, as you will see later, a more subtle change with a hard line for the finish, as opposed to having to do a stark contrast in the finish to separate out that area and give it the look I wanted. I had to deepen out the control cavity a little bit here just because of the length of the shaft of the controls that I'm using and the fact that I'm going to be putting a little bit of plating on there. That's going to kind of further exacerbate that issue. So this is a pretty straightforward thing. I deepen that out, and here's kind of the basic broad shape that I'm going to be using. This is before any of the what I'll call finish shaping, finish sanding, and of course finishing, including on the metal. But that's what comes next. So here I'm doing some of the bevel work, what I'll call the finish shaping. And this part in particular is important. That arm carve feels great, like I said, but it does need to have a bevel or a round. I prefer the bevel. I think the bevel feels better, and personally I think it looks better in that area. But it needs to have something. Otherwise you're just resting your arm on a sharp corner. So having the bevel allows it to kind of feel like your standard arm carve, but for me more comfortable because of the way that I can put my arm on it, because of how I can rest it and my added options there in terms of the angle. The rest of the bottom of the guitar is getting around because that's comfortable in that area. And then of course the belly carve. I'm doing this what I'll call the quick way, using my saber tooth grinding wheel. Although this is in slow motion, you can see this thing removes material very quickly, and I find that this is a great way to do some of this carving work. You can also, of course, do it all by hand. I've got a video on that as well, but there's a certain satisfaction to this as long as you're wearing a mask and goggles, because it kicks up an insane amount of sawdust. Like, it's crazy how much of this goes flying everywhere. This item leaves a fairly rough finish, so we're going to have to come in with the sander afterward, of course. But it does have a nice size wheel to be able to do some interesting carving, and it actually affords a fair bit of control. Certainly not final finish type of control, but enough to get the shape that you want. And if you're looking for something to allow you to get into smaller areas, sometimes these little 3-inch grinders work really well. You can get a little piece of sandpaper for them. All in all, with all of these different curves and angles and things that went into this guitar, there was a lot of finish sanding and shaping work, probably more than I would anticipate on a more classic shape. Usually you put your rounds on there and then you can basically just go ahead and sand. You can sand your round overs pretty easily. You can sand your curves pretty easily, and the rest is mostly flat surfaces. But this one had a bunch of bevels, a bunch of rounds, a couple level drops. So I didn't make this easy on myself, unfortunately, but that's fine. It just meant a couple extra hours probably playing around with the sandpaper, either on a tool or by hand using, some kind of block. Now, when you're playing the guitar, and in particular, if you're someone who likes to hit the high notes a little bit, the heel, where the neck attaches to the guitar, is among the most important places to get right from a comfort perspective. So having some comfort carving done here, some ease of access carving, in my opinion, is very important, and it's something that I think there should be more of, frankly. These hard, square, corner heel attachments, sure, people can play well with them, but it's not that difficult to just remove a little bit more material and make it much, much more comfortable. And certainly, it doesn't create any concerns from a strength perspective, so I'm not sure why it doesn't get done more often. You can see here that I've made some efforts to accent the grain, and by accent I mean deepen significantly, so that when I go to do my finish, I can make use of that very, very open grain to make my finish more interesting. This is something that I was experimenting with before this kit even showed up. I wanted to make sure that I had some options available to me to make the ash look different. I did put on a finish here and remove it, as you will have seen if you watched the guitar body shape reveal. So now I'm putting on a different finish, and I'm starting with some metallic that I will eventually reveal again a little bit. And this is a stainless steel type color put through my gun, and then I go over top of this with actually a reflective rose gold. Now, I couldn't find this for my gun, so I ended up doing it with a spray can. It's the only spray can I used on this guitar, but anyway, it worked just fine. And it gives me a very interesting color in the end, not because the rose gold itself is necessarily an interesting color, but because there will be some stuff added on top of this, and some of it will get rubbed away, and it'll show a little bit of the silver underneath. This is a technique that I developed over the course of a few tests, and I'm going to do a tutorial for at some point. So if you are looking for a tutorial on how to do this finish that I end up with on this guitar, well, subscribe, stick around, because I'll put one up at some point. This is just the first couple steps of several. You'll notice that I didn't use a sealer or a primer on this, so I still have that very open grain available to be able to do something interesting, to be able to accent it further, put something in there, pretty much whatever I want to do. And that's important because it's part of what I have planned for this. I'm going to force a color in there, and I'm going to do it in an unconventional way that, as you can see here, is going to kind of color the entire surface. But then I'm going to come back in and I'm going to remove the excess from the top, and in so doing I'm going to remove a little bit of the rose gold so that you can kind of see some silver coming through, and you're going to get a couple different metallics and some sheen, and also that red accenting the grain and changing the hue of the whole thing. You can also see there that I used that opportunity to create a contrast with the rose gold that's up in the upper horn area. Now, here I'm doing the same thing, but I can't get that buffing thing into that area, so I'm applying it a little differently. I'm using a Scotch-Brite pad essentially, but one with very little abrasive to it, and I'm being very careful. This technique actually allows me to remove even more of the rose gold if I want, so I do need to be very careful about that because you can end up buffing back down pretty far. That is a cool technique that allows me to accent some areas, but if you do it wrong, you end up with pretty much just silver underneath, and that wasn't the goal here. Using this pad, I can add and remove material pretty much at the same time. It's just a matter of changing how I use it, changing the angle of my wrist a little bit, and being careful about how I apply the material to the pad. So you can see I added a lot of red there and then removed most of it very quickly, and then I went in and just kind of buffed the rest off. This thing's gradually changing color, gradually becoming more what I had in mind, and taking on a more aggressive appearance as I go here. So the more I add the red, the darker the whole thing starts to look, but then of course I can always buff it back off to expose that rose gold on top, and that's what I've done for most of this. So you can see we've got a very interesting accented grain look here. It's still very deep, and now it's time to put on the finish. I'm not going to cover that portion in this particular video. We will chat about that, but to sum it up, I put on a catalyzed polyurethane, a 2K automotive polyurethane, as I typically do, to make sure that everything was sealed in and nicely protected. I didn't want this thing to be, subject to minor damage from scuffing and stuff like that, the way that rose gold typically would, or the way that, a non-protective oil finish would be. But with a textured finish like this, you don't want to leave it a hard gloss. In my opinion, that would just look ridiculous. So I went in after and basically removed that gloss and used some Odie's oil, which is a hard wax oil that I've demonstrated on my channel before, to create kind of a satin finish. And that's what we're left with here, is a nice buffed back satin finish with a little bit of waxiness to it. It feels great. The Odie's oil is a wonderful finish in terms of how it feels on the hand when you're using it. So to me, that just adds further to the ergonomics of this guitar, the comfort of playing it. You don't have to worry about kind of sticking to a gloss finish at all. You don't have to worry about accidentally buffing a matte finish up to a satin simply by repeated use. It's kind of the best of both worlds. So I'm very happy with how that finish turned out. Now I'm attaching the plating here to really give it some accents. For me, this is what truly sets this apart aesthetically. This is what really gives it its own look and gives it my look. This patterned aluminum just isn't something that you typically see on guitars, and when I've got it cut like this to kind of match the shapes as you would see in mini pick guards, but sectioned off into various pieces like this, including in the control area and with matching curves for various sections, this to me is a unique piece that really kind of gives this guitar its own personality. So at this point, it's mostly just final assembly, getting the hardware in place. I've got my bumper washers and my large bolts that'll hold the neck on, so you can see that I've got some pretty sizable holes there because I want to make sure that I'm using, a very sturdy fastening mechanism, which is what I have in the bolts. The neck itself has its threaded inserts. I've ensured that I've got the grounding in place, and I'm using a Solo vintage bridge. You'll see that momentarily when I go to install it. The next thing I'm doing here is getting all my shielding ready so that this thing won't make any noise that it isn't supposed to. So that's always an important piece for me. You do occasionally see people assemble guitars without doing this step, and if they're using two humbuckers, which I am, it's probably not the end of the world. But if you're playing next to a neon sign, if you're playing somewhere with a lot of electrical interference, it can be a problem, and I think this step is always worth it, so I always do it. I've kept the electronics very simple on this one. It's just a standard 3-way switch this time, rather than a freeway switch like I used last time with the 6 positions. It struck me that with a slightly more complicated looking guitar this year, it might make sense to keep the electronics a little more simple. I did, however, install some very interesting pickups this year. These are rail hammer pickups. They have both rail and typical magnets in them. So you've got the higher output option of the rail pickups on the bass side of the guitar, and then the smoother option of the standard pickups on the treble side. Don't worry, I don't actually end up installing the bridge pickup backward like that. But anyway, it gets direct mounted because I don't have a plate that goes there. I thought that aesthetically it will look better having that one direct mounted with just that interesting, really sharp cornered looking plate for the neck pickup. So here's how I've installed this. I've tested these pickups out now and I'm very happy with them. They sound very interesting. I did end up removing the rose gold paint that I put on to the magnets. So the magnets are, for lack of a better way of putting it, cleaned off, with the rest of the pickups being that rose gold color to kind of match the overall aesthetic of the guitar. And I think that ended up really cool. Having those silver sections on the magnets kind of matches the rest of the accents. We've got some high quality electronic components going in here and some high gauge wire that you can see. This is the first time you guys will have seen me actually set up a wiring harness this way, using a cardboard box and with everything upside down instead of trying to do this right in the guitar. I don't know why it took me so long to finally do this. It makes sense and it is easier and a little bit faster. And I just made sure that I had enough room to get everything in. I made sure that I had enough wire to make everything reach the appropriate holes on the actual guitar. And that was it. So I've managed a cleaner wiring job than you will have seen from me in the past. Not that it makes much difference. I mean, when all's said and done, it will sound the same as if I had done all of this directly inside the guitar, but I had less opportunities to burn myself this way, and it all worked out quite smoothly. So I was happy with how that went. I'm using the Solo Pro staggered tuners again this year. You'll see I have my plate on the headstock, which is a nice little aesthetic piece that I really love including on my guitars now, but it prevents me from using a string tree or a string roller. So I use a staggered tuner instead, and that sorts that problem out. They are shorter as you go toward the end, so you get a nice string angle. This is it, guys. This is the guitar. You can see my headstock plate like I was talking about there. You can also see that the tuners that are further away are lower. I got the nut all shaped and ready to go. I didn't film that, my apologies, but you guys can find lots of good tutorials for that, particularly on Crimson Guitars channel. You can see how those pickups look now and how this whole thing has come together. I'm really happy with this. I think that this green accenting technique, although new as far as I know, works really well and is very interesting. And it's actually fairly straightforward to achieve. The way that I did it is a little bit more complicated to get exactly what I wanted, but I'll show you guys how it works. You can see how beautifully rounded those fret ends are, how well shaped everything looks on here. This is my new headstock shape that I'm pretty happy with as well. All in all, I don't know what else to tell you except that I really like the way this guitar turned out. I like how the plating looks, I like how the finish looks, and most importantly, I like how it feels, how it plays, and how it sounds. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you're inclined to vote for me, but if you're not, that's fine as well. Go find the builder that you think did the best job and support them and their charity. Remember, these are all for a good cause, so remember to vote, bid on a guitar if you can, and as always, thank you for watching.